Welcome, everybody, to this webinar hosted by the European SchoolNet as part of the ySKILLS webinar series on understanding, measuring, and fostering the digital skills. This webinar will be recorded for research and educational purposes and will be made public on our ySKILLS social media platforms. I'm Leen Danemans, the coordinator of the ySKILLS research project and a professor of communication science at the Institute for Media Studies at KU Leuven in Belgium. First of all, what is the overarching aim of the ySKILLS project?
ySKILLS project is a project that aims to enhance and maximize the long-term positive impact of ICT environment on multiple aspects of well-being for children. And we are especially looking at some aspects like enhancing resilience and through the enhancement of digital skills. So in the first year of ySKILLS project, we have carried out a number of different activities. It's been a very productive year. We are a big consortium of 14 European partners, mainly academic partners, but also European SchoolNet, representing more than 34 ministries of education in Europe. We've published so far 6 reports that correspond to the first 6 deliverables of the projects, and also a number of different publications and blog articles. Our first reports the first report was about children's and young people's engagement with digital skills, a systematic evidence review, and today you will hear more about it with our colleague Leslie Haddon from London School of Economics. We also did a report that was based on a number of interviews with experts from the educational sector, experts from the labor market, and we tried to view what they consider as important digital skills to be acquired in the 21st century. So this is also a report that is available through the ySKILLS website. And what is interesting about it is that it's mainly a reflection of what these different kinds of experts, from teachers to representatives of ministries of education and people active in the labor market, consider that should be the digital skills that children and young people should acquire for their future lives. We also had a report on digital skills, risks, and well-being among European children. And in this report, there was a main focus on trying to understand what are the factors that can help explain how, what are the aspects that actually can help to explain how digital skills are acquired, and what are also the consequences of those skills. So we looked at different levels, cognitive, physical, psychological, social factors that could actually have an impact on how digital skills are acquired. There is also a specific report that focuses on how the relationship between home and school communication and how that relationship can affect children's digital skills development. That report is also based on qualitative data gathered through the interviews with experts from the educational sector. And probably one of the most important achievements this year was the development of the Youth Digital Skills Indicators, which is a report that based on studies, based on a number of literature studies, based on a number of existing tools to measure digital skills, tried to improve the current ways of measuring digital skills among youth, among young people, and trying to look specifically at what actually, how to elaborate a more reliable assessment method. So also not just looking at how young people assess their own skills, but actually how can we measure what they effectively can do and are able to do. And then the last report we presented, we submitted this year, and it's still to be publicly made available. We will launch it in a couple of weeks. Is a digital skills report, is an inventory of actors and factors. And basically that's a short report where we summarize the main findings of and the main reports that were produced in the first year. Next slide, please. Thank you. Specifically, we wanted also to refer to a number of roundtables that we carried out with young people, because there was not a specific deliverable attached to these, but in the project, we give great importance to listening to children's and young people's voices. The whole project is about how we can measure digital skills. It's about understanding how we can foster digital skills. It's about also providing evidence that can support policymaking efforts. But this wouldn't be possible, and we couldn't succeed if we only look at existing literature, if we only do research about children and we don't do research with children. So for us in the project, a core aspect of the project is not just to ask questions to children, just have surveys about them, but actually with them, together with them, understand what are digital skills for them? Why are they important for them? What are the things that matter to them, but also what are the things that worry them? And these roundtables were carried out in 3 different European countries, in Finland, Portugal, and Belgium. And we asked children aged from 13 years old to 18 years old about what they thought digital skills are. And what was interesting in this report, probably one of the main conclusions, what we were really surprised to see that how easy it is for them to refer to online risks, to the things that go wrong, to the things that worry them. And it was not so easy for them actually to refer to the positive aspects of digital skills. So I think that was one of the key issues, and also one of the reasons why we invited also Sonia Livingston today also to discuss these aspects. So are we focusing too much on the negative aspects of digital skills? So, well, I think I would like to give the floor then to our next speaker. Divina is a professor of media sociology at Sorbonne Nouvelle University. She's also UNESCO chair for Savoir Devenir in Sustainable Digital Development, Mastering Information Cultures. So Divina, thank you very much. She will be giving a presentation, and she will be mainly focusing on why does terminology matter when we talk about digital skills. So Divina, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. This is a very exciting discussion that we're going to enter. I hope you can hear me. I'm speaking from Paris, France, and this looks like a very international gathering. I've seen some names among the participants that are coming from different parts of Europe, and this is a very good time, I think, for this discussion. The topic I was asked, and can I have the slides, please? Next slide come up. Topic I was asked was to sort of talk about digital skills and the terminology, and I'm afraid I may be a bit general in consideration to how focused you've been in your research, but maybe is to try to think out of the box altogether about these issues. Next slide. Because we thought and we had advanced in Europe with digicomps, and I'm going to mostly talk about topics in which I participate, and I'm thinking about these issues of competences. But can you remember a time when we didn't talk about competences being done at the time, and the advance that we learned with competences, that we could verbalize, and we could put words on the types of actions and activities that we were doing. And from this point of view, going toward digital competences was a progress, and even more in terms of the EU having a sort of a general framework. And the one you see, the final one we have at the moment, has 5 main dimensions: information and data literacy, communication and collaboration, digital content creation, safety, to address your issue about protectionism and risk, and problem solving. And each of them have been broken down into 21 competences. And here again, terminologically, we have a problem because some of us speak about competences and some of us speak of skills. I think it's a language divide around the English. I think in Europe, in my country, in France, we go for competences and it's equated to skills. I'll come back to that a bit later because I think we have to be very careful here on how we see it. Next slide, please. Because, sorry, no, don't go to the next slide, sorry, go back. The slide at the bottom is how we use them, those digicomps, and it's to do scores and scoreboarding countries and comparing them to each other. You'll notice that the Nordic ones, of course, are at the top, as usual. Which is one of the advantages and the risks of this, of course. It's that we start grading countries. We start focusing too much on results of this kind, and it can deflect policy. But digicomps are about policy making, and it's still important to be able to compare. Next slide. From my perspective, I come more from the media literacy skills, and I'm mentioning here a media literacy mapping we did with the Council of Europe in 2016 to see the 5 or 6 competences that we look, the areas we look. And you see that creativity is something we find, but look at critical thinking, media use, participation, interaction, intercultural dialogue, and we have 5 other sets. And what's interesting is that we have competing frameworks here, and there are limitations. Next slide. The next slide, please. The methodological limitations that we've had is that we had a hard time comparing across countries and making a common evaluation, looking at all kinds of media literacy projects, and they can be very heterogeneous. We missed a universal accepted declaration and definition of literacy and media literacy. And so we were missing also notions what was significant for one country, for one person. So a lot of slippage in the reporting, and I suspect you are experiencing the same thing. Do we use experts? Do we use qualitative? Do we use quantitative? On what items do we put our evaluation? Next slide. And what's interesting in these competing frameworks is that there's overlaps, and I chose to show you a comparison between the EU framework of the digicomps and the one we developed with UNESCO on media and information literacy. And you can see that UNESCO was not so much on the safety and the problem solving, but it was on creativity, it was on communication and information, and the need to define and articulate what is information and what is communication. So we learn from these comparative frameworks, and it's important that they exist. Media Smarts did it just as well. Next slide. And I suggest you go and look at it because they do compare the 2 areas and overlap, and they show that we share critical thinking, we share knowledge building, citizenship, but media literacy is more on ethics and cultural competence, whereas digital literacy is more on maybe on privacy management, on cybersecurity, on online safety. But overall, I think these 2 frameworks cover what we are trying to talk about when we talk about youth digital skills here. I've done the exercise, next slide, in my own country, in France, comparing the different frameworks that we have at university and at school, different matrices that you can see here with several domains, fields, etc. What is nice, and you see it at the bottom in purple, is that basically we fall again on the digicomps, information, but we added documentation and library sciences, creativity, creation, citizenship and security go together, environment, communication, collaboration. So what is interesting is that we are progressively, it seems to me, as we discuss this in Europe and in each country, we're reaching a kind of consensus, maybe not on the competences breakdown, but on the dimensions that need to be covered in the digital world. Next slide. And one dimension that is often forgotten, I would like to bring in the conversation with you, though you're discussing with youth. It seems to me when we look at that, we have to also think about adults and educators and how their professional competences are upgraded to the digital world. So the EU did that with the framework for the digital competences of educators. My problem with that is something that we often find in media and information literacy and in digital literacy, is that it doesn't mirror what we expect young people to learn. Okay, so we find at the end the 6 learners digital competences, but look at what's expected before 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when in fact maybe we should make sure that adults and youth are in phase, in sync with each other, because else you're evaluating them on something different and then there can be disconnects here. Next slide. And so if we try to think about it a bit differently, it seems to me we have to step back about what are we talking about in terms of terminology and what I call male epistemology. What are the key concepts, the key notions that create our field evolving as it is? And the epistemology of media and information literacy has been enlarged from a pedagogical axis where we were mostly discussing about issues of citizenship and creativity and for young people, hands-on approach, active pedagogies, etc., to also a political axis, the citizenship axis that is very important, but that has been mostly promoting issues of protection and privacy and data protection, etc., and a little bit less to the detriment of participation and publication and self-publication, being online, well-being online, but that still remains part of what is important to see. And so I think it's this nexus that should dictate or help us figure out the dimensions, the areas, the competences we want to put forward. Next slide. Next slide, please. And here I wanted to bring to you the competences for democratic citizenship education that has been developed with the Council of Europe, where in fact you see that competence we represent it as a butterfly because we want people to feel engaged by it. And skills is only one of the 4 elements of a wing. And if you have only skills, a butterfly doesn't fly. What is important? Attitudes. So do you change and do you see attitude change? Do you see critical understanding coming in? And I insist values, and because the risk with just focusing on the notion of skills as narrowly understood, it seems to me, is that we lose why we're doing this, and the values that are guiding us and should guide us in this digital world that is new. And of course, it's issues of democracy, and God knows with all the disorder of information we're learning now and we're living now with disinformation, we need it. It's about freedom of expression, it's about justice, fairness, etc. And so it seems to me that this is one of the key roles, is to think of competences as a butterfly with its 4 wings. And that's why I would like also to keep thinking outside the box of thinking of the digital, but that is really a word that is too large, too wide for us to make sense, to think about it as free information cultures, in fact, because then it becomes concrete. And that's why I try to do in my theoretical approach of it as a transliteracy. What are these information cultures that make the digital in the end? It's about media. It's about documents, all kinds, Adobe, Zoom, whatever you want, PDFs, PowerPoints, whatever. And it's about data. And the 3 of them now are converging. And it's this convergence that we have to think when we develop this. And so in each case, you have a different set of competences that come. Editorial competences, organizational competences, operational competences. And this works within and outside the schools. And the pedagogical users should not be separated from the social users. And it's this nexus, I think, that we should keep in mind and make choices about where we want to then zero in and what focus we want to put. For instance, to keep it agile and evolving as the digital evolves too, we are now working in one of our projects called yCheck on visual literacy competences within these three cultures of information. And then in here you see that it doesn't relate to the five main domains that we've seen earlier, or we have to make it look phase with them. But you see that it's about mastering verification tools. It's about being smart debunkers, figuring out designs of images so that you can see if they've been falsified or not, using comparisons, reverse imaging, fragmentations, metadata to verify the source of images, etc., etc. And so we find ourselves literally reinventing and refocusing and re-narrowing these skills. And I think key to the resilience that you were talking about, I talk about information resilience, is this capacity of as adults and with young people to beyond skills, adding values, adding sense, and making sense of what we're doing. And I'll stop here to keep the conversation going. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Divina. Thank you very much. We'll talk more in the discussion, I'm sure, about all the things that you raised. Our second speaker will be Dr. Leslie Haddon. His talk will be on what is known about factors influencing the acquisition of digital skills and what are the main consequences of having them. Leslie is a senior researcher and lecturer at the Department of Media and Communications at LSE. And for the last decade, his main focus has been on children's digital experiences. He helped co-coordinate the EU Kids Online project and was also a member of the team working on the Toddlers and Tablets project, looking at the smartphone and tablet use of 0 to 5-year-olds. Now he's a member of the ySKILLS team and will talk to us about what is known so far about youth digital skills. Leslie, the floor is yours, please.
So I'm going to put a lot of information in these slides so that it's recorded there for you to look at afterwards, but not necessarily talk about every single detail. So there were two questions behind this review. What actors and factors shape children and young people's digital skills? What causes their skills or what leads to them having less skills? So these are the antecedents of skills. And how in turn do their digital skills impact the rest of their life? So this is the consequences of the skills. And this whole study was a systematic evidence review to look at the whole field collected via database searches to see what had been researched in the past and how the findings compared. So you don't have to read all of this, but it's there. This is where we searched. The important part, I think, for you is that on the right-hand side, we're focusing specifically on studies using quantitative methods. That's because we want to compare the figures, and specifically covering the age range 12 to 17. So, for instance, excluding research on younger children. This is a brief outline of the process. I didn't actually put the diagram in you'd usually expect, but the important figure is the one at the bottom. So I'm talking about the 110 studies that we arrived at the end, which we looked at in some detail. So to complement the previous speaker, there was a striking diversity of how skills are measured. The two most important I pick out are self-reports, which you can read here as reported self-efficacy, when people say how good they are at doing something. But there's particular claims about what they can do, knowledge claims, what they do and inferring skill from that. And the other one I'm going to pick out, performance tests, the studies where they're actually tested in the course of the studies to see the level of their skill. Apart from all that, some studies look at a very broad range of skills or broadly defined skills, operational skills or communication skills, and others, the whole study can be of how children look at an online health website, for example. So some are very narrow in their focus. And there's a big range from basic to advanced skills. For example, people mean different things by advanced skills. One means you can go for a lot of technical steps, another means you have critical skills. So overall, this is a challenge, and we have to report in quite some detail what skills are particularly being measured. Notice this is antecedents 1. There's another slide coming, antecedents 2. So you see some areas like age and gender at the top, which I've highlighted, have quite a lot of coverage, 26, 36 studies, and then the others are spread out over quite a wide range of different topics. And the same happens, a focus on socioeconomic status and, for instance, the school, the educational context. And the rest, again, spread out. Now, I want you to remember the general thing about these last two slides is that they're pretty full. Can I have the next slide, please? That's it for consequences. So, far smaller numbers, not in your 20s and 30s, and it all fits on one slide, and a limited range of topic areas. That's the first obvious finding from this study. So, age is, on the whole, unsurprising. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the older children do better. Now, gender is one of the more interesting ones, because if you listen to what boys say they can do, and what girls say they can do, then boys report more skills. But if you just look at the performance test, there's actually no difference. There are very few striking findings, and that's one of them. But this, I find this interesting about ethnicity, because you do find studies where the white or the non-immigrant children have more advantages, but actually the picture is mixed. And there's a number of studies, for instance, where the minority children do better, for instance, evaluating the credibility of online information. So there's definitely something worthy of more attention in those findings. Next one, please. Okay, now here's a measurement anomaly here. If you measure SES by parents' education, then the findings are straightforward. They're more so associated with digital skills. If you measure it by income, you get a mixed picture. And so you can imagine one of the recommendations for further research is, how do you actually explain this? What is happening here? It's obviously not straightforward. In terms of parental mediation, it's the same well, this is reporting a range of findings, but this point has been made repeatedly that parents who practice restrictive mediation, i.e. make rules, in those households, the children have lower digital skills. Whereas if they're supporting their children's use, the children have higher skills. Next slide, please. Now, the only thing I'd say about the schools and teachers was there are only a few studies that found evidence about the positive effect. A lot of the time, on a lot of very detailed things, there's no overall picture. There was no correlation, or you had mixed results. So that was a little bit of a surprise, given how much we tend to promote and appreciate the role of ICTs in schools, that you would have expected even more evidence than you found. The next one is probably a bit more obvious. The more technology is available to the child in the home, the higher the skills. And again, the more they use it, the higher the skills. The more varied things at home, the higher the skills. So I know this is correlations, and there's issues of causality, but this one might be expected. Whereas the next one, gaming and social communication on social media, was also correlated with higher digital skills. Again, you don't know if the people have skills and therefore they're interested in games, you know, if it's that way around. But it's an interesting finding that deserves more attention, especially since gaming and social media are often undervalued by parents and teachers. Next slide, please. So I think the biggest consequence I've already pointed out is that there's a fewer studies than antecedents. As regards well-being, well, we picked this one out because it is the focus of the project. There is some indication of an effect, but it was surprising that there wasn't more research in the area, and a lot of these studies tend to be quite narrow in their focus. For instance, perceived body image. Next slide, please. Learning outcomes, okay. So digital skills were associated with that range you see there, academic performance, creative thinking, spatial skills, etc., etc. But it must have the qualification that it depends. It depends on what skill you're looking at and what is being learned. For instance, having some digital skills didn't necessarily affect your reading ability. Offline activities, again, certain skills were associated with various offline forms of political engagement, making donations, for example, but it depends on the skill and it depends on the offline activity. So it's important to be specific. That is actually one of the findings. Next slide, please. So this is the summary. Overall, I would say if I look at the things I've covered, and it's the same for the things I didn't cover, there are a few surprises, but not that many, at the level of, I don't know, did perceptions and attitudes have an influence on digital skills? Did gender have an influence? And so on, at that level. But I think some of the most interesting insights are actually in the details. For instance, the one I mentioned about on certain skills, ethnic minorities had more of them, which was an interesting detail to follow up, or which skills lead to offline engagement, or which attitudes and perceptions have a bearing on skills, rather than just saying attitudes and perceptions do. It all depends. So the next slide should be the last. Okay, thank you very much. I'll end my presentation there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leslie, for enlightening us on the systematic evidence review as part of the 6 reports that were delivered so far in the ySKILLS project. Now let's move on to Canada and to the practice and the policy. Our third speaker is Matthew Johnson, Director of Education MediaSmart Canada. And MediaSmart Canada is Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy, and Matthew Johnson is an expert, an acknowledged expert in digital literacy and its implementation in Canadian curricula. He is the author of many of MediaSmart's lessons, parent materials, and interactive resources. And he's also a key actor in the Young Canadians in a Wired World research project. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to look today at 3 different aspects of this question. Why it's important to foster digital skills from an early age, the challenges of ensuring that all people have the digital literacy skills that they need, and how we can support people in developing digital skills outside of formal education. The most obvious reason why we need to start teaching digital skills early is that children are using digital technology earlier and earlier. But aside from that, schools are also the best venue for digital skills education. Nearly all people pass through them. Teachers are trained in instruction, if not necessarily in the specific content. And schools are also a source of internet access that may not otherwise be available. Treating digital literacy as a fundamental life skill on a par with print literacy or numeracy communicates the idea that these are skills that we'll use and develop throughout our lives, though we have a ways to go on that front. Circling back to the first point, we need to teach children digital skills early because they are full participants in the online world and need to be taught both to take advantage of the opportunities that affords and to manage the risks that it brings. Digital skills themselves are of no use without a foundation of access. Access in terms of simply being able to access the internet and technology, but also the ability to make full use of digital technology, no matter your age, your language, ability, or disability, and so on. It's only after that foundation is laid that we can develop skills in using, understanding, and creating digital media and technology and work towards full digital literacy. People need a foundation of access skills as well to use the tools or resources available to make access easier or even possible. Everything from using adaptive technology to knowing how to safely connect to public Wi-Fi. But this introduces a conflict because these tools can raise concerns of their own. For example, voice search has been identified as one of the key access skills for seniors and people with low literacy levels, but it's much harder to limit privacy violations when using them compared to web search. There are no easy solutions to this problem, but we do have to be wary of a 2-tier system of digital skills education. Another thing to keep in mind is that digital skills do not advance in lockstep. Even within the different aspects, learners may be more or less skilled in different areas. So, for example, the rioters who invaded the US Capitol in January understood very well how to use social media to promote propaganda for their cause, but don't seem to have understood that doing so would provide evidence of their actions to their employers or to the police. The number of challenges to ensuring that all citizens acquire digital skills is daunting. In fact, this is by no means a complete list, but the ones that we at MediaSmarts have encountered most often in our youth and adult education programs. First, access to the internet and to digital technology is generally uneven and particularly inequitable. Not surprisingly, these inequities tend to parallel other social inequities, but there are exceptions. For instance, a linguistic minority like Francophone Canadians may not be economically disadvantaged, but may still face limited resources in their language. Another issue is that nearly all digital tools and spaces are commercially owned and oriented. That means that each user's participation is contingent on their continued value to the company's business model, and that what users do in them is shaped by design and policy decisions that serve the company's profit rather than the public good. Another concern is that compared to skills such as literacy or numeracy, digital skills are not yet perceived as a right. This is both a cause and a consequence of them having been defined narrowly as job skills or viewed as a means of protecting children, rather than seeing them as enthusiastic and critical users, creators, and consumers. Our research into teachers' use of digital technology showed that the two biggest barriers to teaching digital skills in formal education were that they were not yet integrated into the curriculum and that teachers did not have the training or support to feel confident with any aspect of them, including basic access skills. There are also a lot of cultural attitudes inside and outside the classroom that act as barriers. Schools and teachers are reluctant to provide or allow access to network technology because they're worried about exposing students to risk or that bringing the internet into class will be disruptive. This was one reason we found it was actually more experienced teachers who were more likely to use digital technology in the classroom. Skills in using digital technology are often overlooked because we think youth already know them, something any teacher who's ever watched a class try to do a Google search would know is wrong. Teaching skills to understand digital media can seem too controversial when they address issues like health misinformation or hate content, or too trivial, such as when we try to help students ask critical questions about the social networks they use. And finally, the biggest barriers to having students create digital media are the time it takes and, bringing things around again, limited access to the technology to do so. These are all things that we try to address with our programs, but again, we have a long way to go. A final challenge is that unlike literacy or numeracy, digital literacy is a moving target. Technical skills, in particular, become obsolete quickly. And unfortunately, for most people, there are few opportunities for continued learning once they've left formal education. How can we best address these issues? Individual programs should avoid being focused too narrowly and instead teach digital literacy skills comprehensively and holistically. Because different groups' needs are often different, participants in the eventual programs should be involved in the design of the programs, starting as early as possible. Programs should be designed to teach participants using their own devices, which will generally mean designing them for mobile first or mobile only use. And our teacher research taught us the value of cross-mentorship. In that case, connecting younger, more digitally skilled teachers with older ones with more confidence and content knowledge, but this is equally applicable to adult education in other contexts. Policymakers need to make it a priority to train and support teachers and instructors, including adult education instructors, keeping in mind that different skills and approaches are needed for different audiences. Rather than reinventing the wheel, we should identify, evaluate, and scale up successful interventions. Similarly, we should build on existing networks to deliver training. Public libraries are a good example, but in some cases, organizations with a narrower mandate will be better able to reach the people who are most in need. Given the many ways that inequity intersects with digital skills, it's essential that efforts to teach them not be siloed, but contextualized within broader issues of equity and inclusion. Another role that government and civil society can play is to create and support public online platforms, and perhaps more importantly, empower underserved and marginalized communities to create their own platforms. Finally, government and industry need to work harder to promote inclusion within ICT. We will never have full and equitable use and access to the internet until the people who build and own the tools and platforms more accurately reflect the people who use them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for this very interesting presentation from Canada and from your practice. Actually, I want to invite all the participants in this webinar to please come up with their questions and post them in the chat box, because after the fourth speaker, we will have a discussion with the four presenters. So now on to topic 4. And the question is, does digital literacy education focus too much on online safety? And our speaker is Professor Sonia Livingstone, who is a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Social and Political Science. And she's also a work package leader in ySKILLS. She has published 20 books on media audiences, especially children and young people's risks and opportunities, on media literacy and rights in the digital environment. And her new book, written with Alicia Bloom-Ross, is Parenting for a Digital Future: How Hopes and Fears about Technology Shape Children's Lives. Sonia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lane, and thank you to everyone who has already spoken, because everyone has said many things that I really agree with and endorse. So in a way, it's a puzzle. Why have I got this slightly curious question? And I would say that the answer is that my dear colleagues who you've just heard have been arguing in these very eloquent and informed ways for some years now. And it's not rude, I think, to say that I've heard them all say it before, and they need to continue to say it. And why is that? And I think the reason that they need to continue to say it, and they do continue to say it with great energy and conviction, is that somehow digital literacy education is not yet happening in the schools in the countries that many of us belong to. And I think the reason for that is that somehow the safety agenda has become so dominant and so prominent in the minds of the public, the media, parents, and indeed schools, that when we advocate for and create a space for digital literacy education, somehow what we keep getting is e-safety, and e-safety is vital. Many of us, I know, in this conversation and speakers here today have been arguing about the online risks that the digital world poses children so compellingly that e-safety is finally kind of on the agenda. And a really important dimension of the school, or at least present in many school curricula. But it does struggle to find a place. It does struggle to be sufficiently visible in a kind of convincing way. And I fear we may all know the children, I've certainly interviewed many of them, who when asked about internet safety or e-safety teaching kind of roll their eyes and say with tedium, "Oh yes, miss, we did that last year." Or, "Oh yeah, we do that on Friday afternoons when everyone is exhausted." It's prominent. That doesn't make it successful, but it is one part of digital literacy education. And the challenge I have come to think of as really critical, or one critical challenge, and colleagues have identified others, is where does digital literacy curriculum fit into the curriculum? It is so cross-cutting, it is so all-encompassing. Children are learning in a digital world that figuring out where it goes in the curriculum is such a puzzle that it kind of doesn't go anywhere. I spent last Saturday at an all-day meeting of media education teachers in Britain, a really wonderful, committed bunch of people who, even during a pandemic when there was no time to, they were so exhausted from all the extra work they had, they still spent all their Saturday meeting to share ideas about how to teach media and digital literacy. And they were both optimistic and in love with their subject and deeply depressed about how it's not being implemented in schools, how it's denigrated in schools, how it doesn't find a space in schools. I'm very curious to know what everyone has to say of other countries, but I'm telling you the British perspective. One reason is that computing, or let's say coding as the fashionable thing, took over for quite a while. So for the last few years, when talking to policymakers about where they teach digital literacy education, they say, oh yes, we are now teaching all the kids to code, tick, we've done it. Computing is also very important. Coding is arguably important, though the evidence is yet to be super clear that it really gives children a job in the future. But it's also not the breadth and the ambition of digital literacy education. In Britain, we actually say formally, we do digital literacy in citizenship classes. I ask you where you do that, do it in your countries. But citizenship classes in Britain really are what teachers do on a Friday afternoon when everyone is tired. They have very little time in the curriculum, very little resources in the curriculum, and they are to teach all the aspects of citizenship, often with quite a kind of a individualistic, responsibilizing, grow up to be good kind of a cast, rather than grow up to protest or make trouble or use digital media to do all kinds of other things that one might, that children have a right to do. In Britain, again, last year, I give us just as an example, we finally got a compulsory element from the age of 4, from the very start of school, called relationships, which is a brilliant code word for sex education, but we don't want to say that too loudly. So we now have to teach sex education. Our Ministry of Education today says we do digital literacy education in sex and relationships education. That's where it is. Again, it's a bit marginalized. Again, not all schools do it. Again, we don't know how it's going to be evaluated. But again, it's very kind of focused and particular. Disinformation suddenly gained a lot of attention, and suddenly, I think for the first time, many policymakers scratched their heads and said, now I understand why you wanted to teach children critical evaluation, critical thinking skills, because we have a kind of a pandemic of disinformation, and we don't know, maybe we wouldn't even have had it if we'd been teaching digital literacy all these years. But anyway, so suddenly we have a lot of new curricula. The most prominent one in Britain, I think, is offered by Google, and you can draw your own conclusions. Media studies, well, I don't know, that's where my heart is. And that's why I went to the conference myself on Saturday, and I saw how very many people had that broad idea. But media studies in Britain is an optional course. It's taken by 8% of students max. And it is, you could not get a less valued, more kind of disrespected area of the curriculum. So I drew a little diagram for how I think digital literacy education is happening where I'm standing. I invite you to think about where it's happening, where you're standing. If we can't say to our Ministry of Education, this is where it goes in the curriculum, then I think we will not even get past the door. Then we need to do all the other things. This is where it goes in teacher training. This is where it goes in school assessment or inspection regime. This is how we hope to connect the school curriculum with digital literacy education to what children learn in non-formal and informal settings. But if we can't say, here it goes in the curriculum, we can't evaluate it, we can't promote it. We just have to resolve this one, and we have to make a decision. The difficulty is that education is a matter of subsidiarity in Europe and most places in the world. So it's hard for us to come to a common answer, and that makes it hard for us to speak with one voice. I did just want, in the last minute, I think, remaining to me, to point out that the Council of Europe has been worrying about this particular challenge. And I think many people here fall within a Council of Europe country. And in its latest document, which is to promote children's rights in relation to the digital environment, it has a specific text about the importance of digital literacy, which actually says everything that colleagues have said so far. It should be broad, it should encompass safety, but within that broader critical and creative and participatory idea of digital literacy. It should begin from the start of school and go all the way through and reach out into the home and non-formal and informal learning, and that it should promote equality and inclusion. We recently produced a kind of handbook for policymakers to say this is how to do it, and I seriously hope they will read it, because that is the point of a Council of Europe recommendation, that countries should incorporate and adopt it within all the member states that make up the Council of Europe. But whether that happens is for all of us to encourage. I thought I'd just end on one final point. This is a project I did recently on children's data literacy, which somehow fits within media literacy and digital literacy, of course, and is perhaps the latest idea to gain some attention. And this is a little snapshot of the research that we did with young people, from which perhaps the key thing you might take is children and young people's enthusiasm. They want digital literacy education. I don't think I could say that quite of geography or mathematics or history, though I wish they did want it and they should want it, but they actually really do want to learn about digital literacy and the digital ecosystem of which they're part, and the digital world that they know is their present and their future. And I think we've, many of us, heard this enthusiasm and the things they really want to know and the things they want to be part of changing. The ySKILLS project has been hearing that very much from young people in the round tables. Many other projects, the consultation for the Council of Europe recommendation, also heard this, which is one reason the Council of Europe so emphasized it. So people want, children want to learn about in this case, their data, where their data goes, and privacy and data protection issues. You know, I'm amazed, but I love to find myself last year discussing Cambridge Analytica with 11-year-olds and what it meant, and they want to have that conversation. Why we are not doing it is a big puzzle, but clearly this is a very complex digital world. And I think, just to go back to what Matthew said, maybe teachers are also scared of it. They find it difficult to keep up with themselves. They would love to learn. So I think everyone needs digital literacy education. It is about safety. It's about a lot more than safety. This is not an either or. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Now I think we are ready for a discussion, and I'll invite all the people to who have spoken to put on their image and their mic, and the discussion will be led by Veronica Donoso, consultant at the European Schoolnet and one of our work package leaders in ySKILLS.
Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you, Lynn. And certainly thank you for all the speakers for being willing to discuss with us these very interesting issues, but issues, as Sonia said, that we have been discussing for a long time. We posed these questions because each of you got a question that somehow was coming up from one or from several of the reports that we made available in the first year of ySKILLS. For Divina specifically, the question of the conceptualization and how difficult it is. I think what remains very important from your presentation, have the impression, is that you also go a bit beyond, like we might not need just common definitions. We need dimensions and agree on bigger frameworks so that we would have enough freedom to move, but also kind of an agreement of what are the things that do matter and that should matter. From Matthew, I think it was very interesting to see how he referred to the challenges. It's not that easy to foster digital literacy, but certainly we focus a lot on children and young people, and that's extremely important. But we also need to be aware that there are many people who have left school, people who never had the chance maybe to get that education. Nowadays, they are also dealing with lots of challenges. And I think it is important to understand who's taking care of those people who might be in a more vulnerable position, or the elderly, even teachers. They feel not always, as you said, well prepared to deal with the challenge of teaching and talking about these issues at schools. So I think it's also very important to focus on the perspective of like, what does it mean to educate about digital literacy? And it's not just about educating children, and how do we take on the challenge of bringing a lifelong perspective? And Davina also referred to that when you talked about comparing schools and comparing other frameworks and later stages in life. There should be coherence. And when we start teaching a child when they are 4 years old, when they enter school, then what happens in the rest of their lives? So that coherence seems to be missing in many countries, in many places. And so I do have some questions, and I think in the interest of time, I think I want to focus on a couple of questions that I would like to ask to the whole panel. And I think that what would be, first of all, important, I think we have been focusing on this discussion. You have been focusing on what the issues are and what the problems are. And I think I would like to focus more my questions on what would be possible solutions. And the first one would be, we need a more common understanding. I mean, what do we talk about when we talk about digital literacy? Because that would make our voice stronger, it seems, as Sonia said. We all come out with a different discourse, different perspectives. We don't seem to be talking about the same. But if we come with a common framework on a European level, on a global level, even, our voice might be stronger. What is needed to achieve then that common understanding?
I could start because of trying to do that with UNESCO, but all of you have been putting input there. Sonia mentioned it, and it's horrible because it happens to media literacy and digital literacy all the time when there is a catastrophe. And basically, at the moment, it's the onslaught on values and on democratic values that I think is at last making the politicians start to realizing concretely that they might need media and information literacy. But they are untrained. So I think the place to start at the moment, that's what I'm saying, is not with the young people or the teachers. It's with middle-range politicians who can open or not the decision-making process at the level of their country or the level of their region. And they're not trained in digital literacy at all. And you know, they have secretaries who do their emails and their communications for them, and etc. So they really have no understanding. And of course, because they are in very high positions and they are male, most of them, they do not recognize that. So it's very hard to address to them. So the only way you can do it is by how it threatens you, how you might not be re-elected, how elections lose their integrity. So once more, we're entering with risk, which is the risk of entering with risk. You see what I mean? So you always have to come in, but with this vision that is also about employment, that is also about citizenship at large, and about creativity, because this they understand. Because of what? Because the framework for jobs is creative industries. So you have to be manipulative in the sense that among all the words that I've been trying to put in the conversation, the theoretical ones, and that you've all put in there, we have to pick the ones they can hear, so that we can bring the rest. And you know, once their mind understands that, then we can bring the rest. So we try to do at UNESCO, we try to do like Sonia, and we do it at the Council of Europe. country readiness. How can we help you put policies in place? We did the same thing Sonia did for children's right with digital citizenship education. So we have to keep hammering there. I think the message about code is not all is already something, but it's true that key is putting it into the curriculum. And I'm breaking down personally. I don't know about you colleagues, but I'm stopping to say that media literacy, digital skills literacy should be transversal. I'm starting to say it's got to be a discipline, damn it, because otherwise we're never going to be able to put in place these competences, measure them, evaluate them per se. You know, when it's done in the French, it's the French that is being evaluated. When it's done in history, it's, you know, and we've had a catastrophe right now. We had a professor of history being killed because of teaching media literacy. But he did it, just like Sonia said, on a Friday afternoon before Thanksgiving holidays. Guess what? Total misunderstanding with the parents, total misunderstanding by the colleagues, no support by the administration, and he's dead. He's gored to death. Well, so I'm stopping here, but it's just, we have to stop this, and we have to be much more provocative ourselves and stop being nice about this issue. I certainly am.
Yeah, no, thank you, Divine. I think you're totally right. I mean, we've tried to put this issue in the political agenda, but it's important that we keep on doing it. And I would like to ask Matthew, because you come from a perspective from outside Europe, and it would be interesting to hear that. I know Media Smart is also doing a lot of advocacy, a lot of work. And yeah, it would be nice to hear your.
Well, and I did want to touch on that question of where digital and media literacy should be in curriculum, because what I've really found is that unfortunately it has to be both. To be really effective, it needs to be its own subject, and it needs to be integrated in the rest of the curriculum. And there are a couple of reasons for this. I think we already heard why it needs to be its own subject, because otherwise it gets left behind, it gets left out. It's not seen as a priority, and it's not graded. And we know students and teachers place value on things that are graded. But there's also a lot of really good evidence that there is the relatively little transfer of critical thinking and media literacy skills between disciplines. That learning, for instance, media literacy and critical thinking in a language context or a mass media context or a history context doesn't necessarily transfer to using it in a science context. And so these have to be seen as fundamental skills. We have to think of it in the way we think of writing. And reading and writing. You know, when you're in a history class, you read and you write. It's considered part of doing history. When you're in a science class, you communicate. You do lab reports, you do presentations. All of these things are fundamental skills and also curriculum areas. And we have to get to the point where critical thinking, media literacy, digital literacy are both fundamental skills and integrated throughout the curriculum. And that's obviously what we're trying to do, but I think that's the only way that we are going to both give them the space that they need in curriculum, but also teach them effectively, because, you know, we do have to be aware that we need to show the effectiveness of these areas. They're the new kids on the block of curriculum, and we have to be conscious that if we're teaching something and the transfer of skills isn't clear, that hurts us.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that's a very good point. And many times we hear that, yeah, we need to give more attention to it, that it should happen in education. But also, as you mentioned, your presentations, teachers do not feel ready for that. Leslie also made the point that when it comes to to digital skills, we see little positive impact of what's happening at schools. Unfortunately, research is not really supporting that. And yeah, we also mentioned, Leslie, for instance, that we do see positive correlations between aspects which would be considered traditionally as not part of formal education curriculum, like the use of social media or even gaming. So do you think there might be kind of a disconnect between what's being taught at school and the way we are designing curriculum and children's lives somehow, and how, if teachers are prepared for that? I think everything is seems to be pointing to the direction that we have teachers who want to feel prepared, we have students who want to learn, but apparently they are not being taught in the way that they wish, but they're still learning outside of the school. So what could be a solution there? Should we incorporate more social media, more gaming, more things that are engaging? And how should we then prepare teachers to deal with this challenge? Because I think what we hear when we talk to teachers is that they don't want to get into trouble. They don't want to use social media. They don't want to let kids game because they feel that they lose authority sometimes, or they would have disciplinary issues. So how can we deal with this very specific challenge? Bring it more to schools, make it very present in the curriculum, but on the other hand, prepare teachers to feel comfortable with it. Who would like to answer the question? Sonia, yes, please go ahead.
I'm not sure I am going to answer your question, Veronica, because I think your question, though I agree with everything you said, is still about us trying to persuade schools. And I think I'm with Davina. I'm running out of persuasive efforts, and I'm looking for other kinds of levers. So there are three that strike me. One is, forgive me, two of them are British, but the reason that we teach e-safety in British schools is not actually because we all begged for it or parents care about it, but because somebody got it in the school inspection regime. And so now every school is assessed on whether they have got a tick for e-safety, and suddenly, pow, you get the result. So that's one message. The reason we're teaching sex and relationships education was a very concerted campaign not to persuade teachers or schools or find space, but to change the law. And I don't know if anyone has much hopes of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, but I think that is a really key bit of European legislation which requires countries to report on the improvements they've made in media literacy. So I'm looking for regulatory solutions because those don't come and go when the minister comes and goes. And once they are structurally embedded, other things, resources, systems adjust around them. And then I think we might make progress.
Thank you, Sonia. Good point. Davina, yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, to try and answer your question, I agree with Sonia, and we are getting legislation. That's positive, and it's thanks to the efforts of really a lot of actors across the spectrum. Point of vigilance, what are the platforms going to do? I'm terrified when I see Google giving a handbook. Right now, I'm in a face down with Facebook in France because they don't even hear about competences. This is a total new thing for them. For them, as long as kids are able to put stories on Facebook, they are literate, and this is what they're going to push, and it's their role. But we just can't let it go like this. But anyways, what is still missing, I'm seeing in the chat that people are saying, yes, now about 11 countries in Europe have adopted the DG Comp, and it's good, but it's not even half. So it shows you that this discussion about competences is not yet there. And especially as we're trying to understand it, the butterfly, the whole thing. There's still places where, and even in those countries where the competences are accepted, there's still talking about one disconnect that I find very problematic, and I just don't know how to address it, is that teachers are still being trained in acquiring the knowledge of a discipline. So for them, it's about knowledge. It's about knowledge in history. It's about knowledge in French. It's about knowledge in any. But the students are evaluated on their competences, outputs, outcomes of different kinds. It's just, this is not talking to each other. There's no mirroring of what they are trained to learn and what the kids are expected to learn. And so the teachers not necessarily have capacities for producing deliverables with Facebook stories and et cetera. They only evaluate very traditional, old-fashioned dimensions of literacies, not the new creative ones, not the necessarily the critical ones, even though critical thinking is probably one of the most focused on. And so there is something definitely obsolete about the way we train teachers in higher education training institutions.
Thank you, Divina. I'm a bit concerned about the time. I'm really sorry we had at the beginning that small technical problem. We are already over time, and I think we could spend really like a couple of hours at least discussing this. But I'm glad that the message, I think it's the strong message has been given today. I think we need to push to work more together, definitely keep on pushing for these issues on the political agenda, as Sonia and Divina rightly pointed out, but we cannot also lose sight of the actors in the field and the people who are actually making the difference and impacting children, impacting other people, and supporting them in the development of digital skills. So there's lots to be done. I would like to maybe ask Lynn to round up the webinar. I'm very sorry that we couldn't take on all your questions. It came in a bit late, and we are already over time. So thank you so much, everyone, for your presentations today and for the discussion. But this is just the start of the discussion. We will keep it on. And certainly, please, if you're interested, please tweet about it, send more messages. We can certainly keep it up. And the questions that we received on the chat, we will have a look at them. And if there's something very specific for any of the speakers, we will send them to them and we will try to get an answer back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the discussion, and sorry for the beginning. Yes, we see that you may have some skills, but you need access and infrastructure. And right away in Belgium, we have, at least the area where I live, we have a serious problem, because I have access to 2 providers and none of them worked at that particular moment of our beginning of this important webinar. So lots of apologies for that. So by way of conclusion, and after having heard the speakers and having heard the discussion, I believe it's fair to say that the increasing complexity of the conceptualization of terms such as digital skills, competencies, media digital and information skills leads to confusion. So rather than confusion, we need conceptual clarity to develop this overarching, this systematic strategy for the development of media literacy and digital skills, because only then can policies be outlined based on a competency model, taking into account the age and the education level of children and young people. And only then can a broad or a specific approach to digital skills be chosen by the policymakers. There is also a need, I think, for more theoretically informed, reliable and valid instruments that can measure developments in this area. And that's why our YDSI, the Youth Digital Skills Indicator, precisely aims to fill this gap, and why it can be an important game changer. Also, from a research and a policy-making perspective, we need to ask ourselves whether we're paying enough attention to what children and young people are telling us. It's important to continue finding ways to incorporate their voices more actively in our research, as well as in a policy-making effort related to their engagements with digital technologies. And the new EU strategy on the rights of the child also focuses on fostering children's participation. So I would say, let's not despair. We have to make our voice heard to the policymakers, to the legislators. I think the momentum is there. There is in Europe adequate legislation on its way. So I want to thank all the speakers for their thought-provoking presentations, and also the very interesting questions that still passed at the very last minute on the chat box. If you want to stay up to date with ySKILLS findings, check please our website for regular updates. We do release a blog at least every month on ySKILLS.eu. Follow us on our social media channels, and we also will start with a newsletter very soon. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for being with us.